this lesson, we're going to ask and answer the question, what if God doesn't fix it? And we'll also see what our response should be, and then there's a typo, cut that out. But if God does, or what our response should be if God doesn't answer our prayers, fix whatever it is we might be going through. So I think probably the number one question that we ask is, whatever we're going through, is, what if God doesn't fix this? Because we're praying, we're asking for whatever it might be, we're asking for relief, or for sometimes we're like, help me learn the lesson quick so I can move on. But then sometimes we get into some scary stuff and we think, what if it doesn't get better? What if it doesn't get fixed? How am I going to keep going in life in this way? And sometimes God fixes it. A lot of times he does. Sometimes he doesn't. And so when he doesn't, how do we as Christians respond? For many, it's a crisis of faith. God's not there because he didn't answer my prayer. If God loved me, then this wouldn't be happening to me. And a lot of them take off in their faith. So we're going to look at three different people in this lesson whose suffering was not fixed. The first is Paul. And then we're going to go back and look at John the Baptist again, briefly, since we already looked at him. And then we're going to look at David. We haven't talked about David yet. And we're going to examine how they responded when they requested God to fix their situation. God said no. So if you would, turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to start at verse 7. A lot of us know this story. We're just going to look at it real quickly. Verse 7, because of the, this is Paul talking, he's writing, says, because of the surpassing greatness of revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. So Paul said he received a thorn. And a lot of people ask, what was the thorn? Well, he didn't say, so I don't know. But there's a lot of speculation of what the thorn could be. Some think it was bad eyesight. Some people think it was the shame of being let down in the basket and running from persecution early on in Acts. You see that story. We don't know, though. But this is what we do know from this verse that I just looked at. We know that the thorn was from Satan. It says, given to me, thorn in my flesh, and messenger of Satan to torment me. So we know it's from Satan, so this is spiritually sourced. So the source of this thorn, this torment, is spiritual. But it doesn't mean it's not affecting him physically. And because he was tormented by it, it hurts severely. That's number 2. So this means he physically endured it. So the thorn in his flesh, it's not the type of flesh that's sinful flesh. This is probably the type of flesh that's physical. So there's some sort of thorn, ailment, something that's torturing him, but it's in his flesh. So it's probably some sort of physical, I have no idea, but I think it's affecting him physically. But he says that it was given to him to keep him from exalting himself. And at the end of verse 6, it says to keep me from exalting myself. Is keep him from exalting himself, or like being pretty high on his horse, because, like he says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations that he received. So who knows what all that is? We know Paul saw Christ after the resurrection and ascension. He talks about that in Galatians. We know that Paul, he talks about, he knows a guy, but everyone's pretty sure he's talking about himself being caught up to the third heaven and seeing things that words can't express. So Paul, probably being the guy who wrote most of the New Testament, probably God or Christ showed him a lot of things. And to keep him from getting a big head, it looks like God allowed this suffering to happen to keep him from exalting himself. And we talked about that with Bartimaeus, right? That suffering has a way of humbling us. And that's the case here with Paul. So, number 3, kept Paul from exalting himself. And it was God allowed. God allowed it. Just because it's satanically sourced or from Satan, it's like Job. God's the one who allowed it. So how did Paul respond to this suffering? It says, concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. So he submits his request. This is his prayer. And when something happens, this is what we should do. We should ask God to remove it. We should ask God to deliver us from it. I guess it depends on what it is, but in a situation like Paul's, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, this is tough. Help me. End this for me. Remove this from me. It says he pleaded with God 3 times. I don't think this was like a, hey, God, will you take this? And he didn't do it. And then like the next morning he got up like, hey, God, I know I asked yesterday, but will you take this away? And he didn't do it. And then the 3rd day. I think this is like 3 big sessions like of just pleading with God. I mean, it could have been over a course of time. It could have been like a whole week, and then he kind of moved on, and then like a couple weeks later he just pleaded. I don't know, but that's how I would take it, is that these are like moments of just desperate pleading for God to remove this torment from his flesh. And God's response is no. God did not give Paul the fix he requested. He asked that it be removed, and God did not remove it. But what did God give him? It says he gave him grace and power instead. It's in verse 9, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. And then Paul goes on to say, most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults and with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So he says that God didn't give him the answer he wanted, but what did God give him? God says, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect. So the idea behind perfect, well, the blanks are God's power is perfected in weakness. But the idea behind perfect has the idea of fullness. Often we talk about it has a maturing effect, like so a believer is perfected, they're matured, they come to full. And so that's the idea that God's power is made full in his weakness. In weakness here, the word here has the idea of infirmity or feeble or bodily weakness. So that would suggest again that this is a physical suffering that Paul's enduring. Even though it's spiritually sourced, it's affecting him physically in his body. The thorn is in his flesh. And I think this is hard. I don't know what he dealt with, but this is what, and hopefully we see it tonight looking at these 3 guys, but they're all throughout the Bible, examples of people who are godly, who are faithful, and then God doesn't help them, you know? To me, that's always hard. But look at Paul's response to God not fixing the pain. It says, he submitted himself to God. So when I am weak, I am strong. And the strength there he's speaking of is Christ's strength, Christ's full strength in him. He's not saying that I'm strong on my own. He's saying, in my weakness, in my own feebleness, in my infirmity, whatever it is, he's saying that Christ's power is made full in him. And so that's why he says, most gladly, therefore, I'd rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. And Christ's power, it dwells in you in a very visible way when you suffer. I would say even more so when you suffer faithfully, right? And this is all kind of going towards this last lesson next week, the cruciform life. And we're going to see three guys that are good examples of it for us, but then ultimately we're going to see Jesus, right? And he's the one that suffered faithfully to the point of death. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. So, Paul submitted his request, then Paul submitted himself in the boasting of his weaknesses, or his weakness. And this is the formula that I take from Jesus, and I've just seen it in these other people. So, right, Jesus, he's in the garden, and what does he do? He's praying. He makes a request. Yeah, let the cup pass from me. But then what does he say? Let this cup pass from me,
your will be done.
But let your will be done. So he submits his request, take this cup from me, but then he comes back with submitting himself, but your will, not my will. And that's the formula I see from Jesus. That's what I see from Paul. We're going to see it again here in a minute with John the Baptist and then King David even. So Paul submitted his request, then he submitted himself in the boasting of his. So we see his submission in the fact that he kept going on. He's like, some people could have been like, woe is me, blah, blah, blah. But Paul says, okay, well, if my weaknesses are going to be a visible way for people to see God's power, then I'm just going to keep on bragging about it so people keep on seeing the fullness of Christ's power in me. And so that's his way of submitting himself to God, not being mad that he didn't get the answer, but going with God's plan, being faithful. All right, let's go back to Matthew chapter 11. This is the kind of second half of what we looked at a few lessons ago with John the Baptist. All right, so the last time we saw this, we looked at John the Baptist, and we saw how he suffered. Quiz you, how did John the Baptist suffer? We said he suffered unexpectedly, right? And we looked at how he sent his disciples to Jesus, kind of like, what's going on? I'm in prison, you're the king, when you're gonna bust me out of the joint, basically. And he sends the disciples back with a message, right? Do you remember what that was? He quotes Isaiah in two different places.
I have received this sign.
Right, so he gives this, like, yes, I'm the Messiah, because this is what I'm doing, but he leaves out the part that says, and the captives will go free, and the brokenhearted will be restored. And then he adds another one, and he says the poor have the gospel preached to them. But before that, he says the dead are raised up, right? And we said that's not in the actual verse that he's quoting. So Jesus adds that as a encouragement. I'm not going to bust you out. You're going to die, but the dead are raised. So there's the hope of the resurrection. And then he goes into verse 6, blessed is he who does not take offense at me. And that's because he's saying, when Jesus doesn't act like we expect he should, it's easy to stumble in our faith and say, well, I'm out. That's not the God I signed up to worship. But John the Baptist didn't do that. And that's what makes John the Baptist such a great example of a disciple, is that he remained faithful to the point of death. And if you're following the story of Matthew, you're like, well, if this is Jesus' right-hand man, and he stays faithful to the point of death, and then you go along in the story, and like, well, now the Messiah is faithful to the point of death, why would I ever want to join this movement? You know?
What's it going to require?
And that's the question I think Matthew wants the readers to ask is, what is this going to require of me if I join the kingdom movement? It's going to require your life, maybe even physically your life. But what do we have? Here we have the hope of the resurrection. At the end of Jesus, what do we have? 3 days later, tomb's empty. So we have the hope of the resurrection, and that's what makes us crazy enough to follow the movement. So John does not take offense. He stays faithful. And then he goes, verse 7 says, as these men were going away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. He says, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who wear soft clothing are kings in palaces, or in kings' palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and one who is more than a prophet. Oh, I kind of skipped some stuff. So, offense means to stumble. I put the Greek word scandalizo there. So we get the word scandalize or scandal. Scandals cause people to stumble. So that's the idea behind that. And so he tells John he's not going to fix the situation. And then he turns to the crowds, like what I just read, and he said, what did you go out to see? And the answer is a prophet. But not just any prophet, the greatest. And he says, no one born of women is greater than John the Baptist. And last time we talked about, okay, what does it mean to be, if the least in the kingdom are greater than John the Baptist, what does that mean? You guys remember? Of all the people born of women, I should write on the board. It's so clean. So, of those born of woman, John is the greatest.
Your hand's upside down.
Loudly.
Oh,
That's
that-
what you mean.
what does that mean?
What are you trying to tell us, Pete? Is there a sublime in here?
Woman. So, born of women, John is the greatest. But then in the kingdom, the least is greater. So how do you get into the kingdom?
By faith
By faith.
in Christ.
And then John chapter 3 says what? Nicodemus, like Nicodemus, Nick at night,
Born again.
Huh?
Born again.
born again. So born of God. So those who are born of God are automatically greater than those who are born of women. And it's not saying that John's not going to be rewarded or great at all in the kingdom. What they're saying is, John is the greatest. Here, born of women in the flesh, he's the greatest. But Jesus' point is, those who are born of God are even greater. So when we get to the kingdom, there's going to be a status change of greatness. So John the Baptist is the greatest among women. And I think it's because of those who are born of the flesh. Like, I don't know very many people would have kept the faith in that situation. Because when you look at John's life, he did everything right. Everything. Like, I'm sure he messed up. But in the telling of the story, when you read Matthew or Mark, he's the perfect disciple. He's the perfect right-hand man for the Messiah. Like, he could not have picked a better messenger to prepare the way. In everything John did, he was faithful. In everything he did, he was humble. Like, there's not a moment in his story where it's like kind of questionable or ambiguous like it is in other people. David, he's a pretty ambiguous guy. Like, David, you're a man after God's heart. And then on your deathbed, you're like, here's my hit list. You know? It's like, figured you mature by your deathbed. But that's David, you know? But not John. John does everything right. He never asks for anything. He's not wearing clothing that's fit for kings. He's not getting any sort of payment. He's out there eating bugs, wearing very uncomfortable clothing. But he's doing it because he's faithful. And after all that sacrifice, after all that selflessness, kind of would like a reward. And all he's wanting to do is get out. And Jesus says no. I would be mad. I'm just being honest. If I were...
Yeah, but he did get out. When they cut his head off, he got out.
He went on. Well, Lord. Yeah. That's not how I think he wanted out, though. But yeah, I was throwing a huge tantrum in my cell when the disciples come back to tell me, you're not getting out.
Look, I need a minute.
I need more than a minute. I need something to break.
I think he wanted to get out so he could tour with Jesus.
To do what?
He wanted to get out so he could tour with Jesus.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Because remember, the Jewish mindset was present age, age to come. The king's here, and what was the message? They both were saying, kingdom is at hand. Like, it's about to happen. It's so close, it's at hand. So he's like, I don't want to miss the party. Literally, the kingdom is described as a big party. It's a banquet, right? It's a feast, how it's described. He doesn't want to miss out on that. He definitely doesn't want to miss out on the inauguration of it. He wants to see Jesus put all the enemies, Psalm chapter 2, where the Messiah subdues the nations. He wants to be there for that. But that was his expectation, and Jesus doesn't always fit our expectations. And Jesus in this lesson is saying, or in this chapter, he's saying, I'm not always going to be who you expect me to be. I'm not always going to act like you expect me to act. Blessed is he who doesn't stumble at that, who keeps on believing. So, I don't even know where we're at in the notes. He didn't let his unmet expectation of Jesus cause his faith to stumble. And that's why he's the greatest among women. Because he had great expectations. He is the guy they prophesied about to prepare the way. He's coming in the power of Elijah. And this is the kind of thank you he gets, is your head's going to get chopped off. But see, he didn't even know that the Messiah was going to die. Right? His expectation was the Messiah is going to kill the enemies. So again, we see John submits his request. I take that in the form of the question. He's being polite about it. He submits his request to Jesus to get out. But he didn't get the answers, or the answer he wanted. So then John submitted himself to the news of his imminent death. I think he knew what was coming next. If you're not getting out, you're going to die. Sooner or later, if you're not getting out, you're going to die there. And this is why he's the greatest too, is this is called the cruciform life. And like I put in the notes, nobody does it better than John the Baptist. If you have time, you're like, I don't know what I'm going to study, go to Matthew and start and just pick out all the spots where John is in the story and just pay attention to him. And then try, I don't know if you've ever had an expectation of Jesus that Jesus was like, that's not how I roll. And it's kind of earth-shattering. Then you can identify with John. And that's why I always say I hate John. Because it's so challenging. I don't hate him. The story is always challenging to me. He's, I think, one of the most challenging characters in all the Bible. Just because his faithfulness is like, it seems so challenging to me. And his faithfulness, even when he got the bad news. This is also called a cross-centered life. So cruciform life, a life that is modeled after Jesus going to the cross, or cross-centered life, going back to the idea of discipleship. What's a disciple? Someone who denies themselves, picks up their cross, right, and follows Jesus. That's a death. We talked about to be a disciple means you're, by definition, are suffering some sort of loss because you're denying your self-interest, you're denying your own way of life. I think to pick up your cross is to embrace the shame that comes with Jesus. I don't think we realize that in our culture because Jesus is kind of in, but around the world he's definitely not. So John submitted his request, then he submitted himself to the news of his imminent death. All right, David. Flip all the way back to 2 Samuel, chapter 12.
Same.
Let me know when you're there. Just verse 1.
No, chapter 12.
Chapter 12.
Oh, chapter.
You have on here 15.
Well, we'll get there.
Okay, I'm looking at the one.
I'm gonna,
Is it second Samuel?
yeah, 2 Samuel.
Which chapter?
12.
Okay.
So we know the story of David, and we know his big mess up. The chapter right before this is the whole adultery, Bathsheba, murder of Uriah. So that's the context here. That has just happened, and God sends Nathan to David. Verse 1 it says, then the Lord sent Nathan to David. And the only reason I'm putting this in here is if you go back and look in the chapter before, get your marker out and look how many times David sent. David sent this person, David sent for Bathsheba, David sent. And the point is, David, as king, starts to think he's God and starts acting like God. I'm going to send you for this, I'm going to send him to the front line, I'm going to send this. And after that whole mess of David pretending to be playing God, then God shows up and says, then the Lord sent. And the Lord sends Nathan. You guys remember what Nathan said? He gives a story. It says there's 2 men in one city, a rich and a poor. The rich man had a great many flock and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he bought and he nourished. It grew up together with him and his children. It would eat of his bread and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd to prepare for the wayfarer. Isn't that a store? Anyway, who had come to him. Rather, he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger burned greatly against the man, and said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves death. He must make restitution for the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and had no compassion. Nathan then said to David, you are the man. So David's had his aha moment, his I'm in trouble moment. I've been playing God, now I realize I've just made a mess of things. And he says that restitution the man needs to die, first of all, but then he needs to make restitution fourfold. You know where he gets that? I'll take you there. Exodus 22, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox or 4 sheep for the sheep. And so that's where David's getting this. He needs to make restitution fourfold. So David realizes he's that guy. He's murdered. And he needs to pay fourfold. And so he will. And as you go from here, this is where David's story just goes upside down. God allows David to live, right? David deserves death. There's sins called high-handed sins in the Old Testament. If you commit a high-handed sin, there is no payment. There's no sacrifice. There's nothing you can do. This is a high-handed sin. And so there's nothing David can bring to God for forgiveness of this.
So there's no
sin.
atonement for it.
Not for this. Now, some say the Day of Atonement could cover it, which I think Day of Atonement covers high-handed sin, but what he deserves is death. But God in his grace allows David to live, but David still has to pay fourfold. And so that's where we're at in the story. In verse 15, then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David so that he was very sick. In verse 16, David therefore inquired of God for the child. That's his request. He requests that the child would live. And David fasted and went and lay all night on the ground. So David is going to have, for the rest of the story, he's going to have 4 sons that die. Amnon is one. Absalom is another one that dies. And then the last one in the story is Adonijah. You guys know who spell those?
No.
Which one?
The
I'm gonna check myself so I'm not stupid on camera. Did I spell it right? And then the last one is the baby. So David submits his request in verse 16. Verse 17, the elders of his household stood beside him in order to raise him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat food with them. Then it happened on the 7th day that the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead. For they said, behold, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to our voice. How then can we tell him that the child is dead, since he might do himself harm? But David saw that his servants were whispering together, and he perceived that the child was dead. So David said to his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. So here's David's response. So David arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, changed his clothes, and he came into the house of the Lord, and he worshipped. So we see in verse 16, David submits his request. And then in verse 20, we see that David submits himself. So when David goes into the house of the Lord, what do you guys think of? I'm curious. When it says David went to the house of the Lord and worshiped, what is that? You think he turned on some Chris Tomlin?
Go to the temple.
Yeah, the temple, the house of the Lord. So
Tabernacle at that time, right?
tabernacle because it's not built. So he goes to the house of the Lord. What does worship look like?
Humility?
There's definitely going to be humility involved. But in the Old Testament, how do they worship?
Does it make a sacrifice?
Make a sacrifice. There's a lot of sacrifices. Let's guess. Because that's all we're going to do, right? Because it doesn't say. I have a pretty good idea. It could have been actually a handful. I think he offered a burnt offering. Are you familiar with the burnt offering? It's what it sounds like. Just burn up the whole offering. So bring an animal. There's a couple of choices, and it's a full dedicate. They're dedicating the full animal to God, burn everything up, and it all goes to God. So some the priest can eat from, some both priest and worshiper can eat from, but the burnt offering is completely burned and devoted to God. And that's an offering to show your devotion. It was not required. It was a free will. It was a voluntary sacrifice. So I think he went and worshiped through recommitting his life, if you're Baptist.
You walked down that aisle.
Yeah, I think this was he knows he deserved death. He knew he had to pay fourfold, and this was the first. And so he knew it was coming, and he still worships God. He made his request, and he didn't do it, or God didn't answer it. In verse 21 it says, then the servant said to him, what is this thing that you have done? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but when the child died, you rose and ate. And David said, or he said, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me that the child would live. So he makes his request on the basis of God's grace, because that's all he can appeal to. But he accepts the fact that he messed up big time and there's consequences. And I'm glad we don't live under the Old Testament. Who knows what I would have lost by now? Probably my life. I'm a sinner. But he could have also done a peace offering. That would have been another one he probably could have done. Or it's also called a Thanksgiving offering. So it could have been just a Thanksgiving. You didn't kill me, so thank you for that. But regardless of what it was, it's an act of worship. It cost him something. So David submitted his request. Oh, that's a typo, because I copied and pasted from John. He submitted his request, and then David submitted himself by demonstrating his devotion to God. Even after the no answer, even after the loss, that obviously was hard on him. He mourned for 7 days. Even after that, he still got up, and his response was to worship. And he re-devoted his life to God. He said, no more playing God. That didn't work out. So what does submitting oneself look like in this context that we're talking about? We have Paul, we have John, we have David. Surrender. Okay. I'm guessing you have the sheet answers. But you're right. I say surrendered worship. Submitting oneself isn't just surrendering, say, well, I'm powerless here, whoop-de-doo. It's surrendering yourself knowing who you're going to rely on in worship. So surrender, in all these cases, they submit the request and then they submit themselves. What does it look like when you ask God to fix what you're going through and you don't have the answer yet, but regardless, what are you going to do? You're going to surrender yourself in worship. And then when the answer is no, what are you going to continue to do? Surrender yourself in worship. Doesn't make it easy, but that's the model from Jesus. So how did these three men worship? Paul submitted himself by boasting in his weakness. So that's surrendering himself. He's saying, I'm not going to fight it. This is my weakness, and I'm going to, instead of push against it, I'm going to embrace it, and I'm going to brag about it, because when I brag about my weakness, God's power is made full through me. John the Baptist submitted himself in his imminent death. That's worship. That is a surrendering of your will to God's will. I've never heard of one. David surrendered himself going to the house of the Lord to offer sacrifices. These were, like I said, voluntary sacrifices. It wasn't like, all right, Nathan's here. He said, now this is what you got to do. Here's the protocol. He went on his own volition to worship God. And that took surrender. When God does not answer the desperate nighttime prayer, our response, surrender ourselves in worship. And something that's not in the notes that I should have put in the notes is just because God doesn't answer the prayer like we want deliverance out from whatever we may be enduring, that doesn't mean that He's not going to deliver us in our suffering. So we might not always get delivered out of our suffering where we're removed from it and it's over. We might have to stay in it, but He'll deliver us within that suffering. Do you guys know what I'm saying by that? With some examples, obviously we have these, but obviously Jesus, right? He was delivered in His suffering. God helped Him. I think who else comes to mind? Someone that you see God deliver them. Anybody who really is, well, I guess you could do the Hall of Fame of Faith guys. So Romans 12:1 and 2. You don't have to turn there if you don't want to, I'll just read it. Paul says, therefore, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. I know why they say spiritual service of worship, but like the words, actually, your logical or reasonable act of worship, like this is just what makes sense to do. After all that God's done for you, what is logically reasonable for you to do is to live for Him, the one who died for you. But these words here, your service of worship, those are the same like words in the Old Testament Greek version of the Bible of what the priests used to do when they would execute worship and stuff at the temple. This is what they did, and Paul's picking up on that image that that's what we do. We're supposed to be functioning as priests who worship. And that worship is presenting our bodies as living sacrifices. So we're not a dead sacrifice. We live our life as a sacrifice. We live our life surrendered in worship to Him. So I put, what is surrendered worship? And I think it's faithful obedience in response to who God is and what He has done in Christ. So when He says, by the mercies of God, present yourselves, or present your bodies, I think the mercies of what God has done in Christ and the blessings we have by faith as a free gift, by His mercies. Mercy there is actually the idea of compassion. It was His compassion that moved Him. All right, I'm going to flip to Psalm 73. Just as kind of as we move into the applicational part of this. Because I don't know about you all, but I ask for things and I feel like God shuts it down. He says no. A lot.
A lot.
And I don't think I'm the only person. So I thought I would kind of share what God's been showing me. And it's in Psalm 73. So when I was 18. I think that's how old I was. It was towards the end of high school. And I was saved when I was 9. I put my faith in Him. But I kind of did not live the surrendered life, Christian life. You know what I mean? But God, through certain things, humbled me, and I figured out the Christian life, and that's when I started trying my best to live surrendered. And it was kind of costing me some stuff along the way, but I was like, that's all right. And I came across verse 25, and it says, Whom have I in heaven but you, and besides you I desire nothing on earth. And wherever I was in life at that time as an 18-year-old Eric, that was like, that's it. Like, that was like all that, I mean, that made sense to me. Like nothing else really mattered at that point. All the things that I've been kind of desperately fighting to hold on to in my life, and I started kind of losing, just seemed to like not matter. And so this verse became really powerful for me. But then fast forward, how old am I? About 18, like 22 years. And I've kind of forgotten about the verse. And I've been for a while wondering like where some of that younger, like gung-ho faith has gone. You know, it feels like I've grown in my faith. I've grown in wisdom. I've grown in understanding of the Bible. But it seems like that early on energetic fire, that whatever that was, is kind of just like, I don't know if I can just like calm down. I don't know what I did, but I miss it. I want it because that got me through so much. And so 2 days ago, quiet time, I was like, that verse popped in my head. So I opened my Bible and I started reading it, and I was like, that's a good verse. Maybe I should look at it in its context. So then I went back and read Psalm 73. And so the context of verse 25 is against the backdrop of, I'll just look at verse 1. He says, Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, like there's your pivot there. God's good. But as for me, my feet came close to stumbling. My step had almost slipped. And then he says, why? For I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there were no pains in their death, and their body is fat. So we probably be like, huh? Who wants a fat body? But that's the idea of luxury, prosperity. If you're fat, that means you're getting fed. You're not working to the bone. They are not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like mankind. I mean, it's like, it just seems like these people somehow, nothing touches them. Life just doesn't get them. They're just like above all the worries and trials of life. Verse 6, therefore pride is their necklace, and the garment of violence covers them. Their eyes bulge from fatness. That bulge means it goes out. They're probably so greedy from being fat, you know, like getting everything they want, appetite being met, that their eyes go out wanting more. That's how I take it, at least. Their imaginations of the heart run riot. They mock and wickedly speak of oppression. So that means they just joke around about it. They speak from on high, so they're in control. They have the power. They have set their mouth against the heavens. So there's this arrogance, they're better than God. And their tongue parades through the earth. And so he's saying he almost slipped because he's looking at all these people and he's envious of them. I'm doing everything right. And they're not. But they're getting everything and I'm getting nothing. So therefore his people return to this place, and waters of abundance are drunk by them. They say, how does God know? And is there knowledge with the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked. And always at ease. They have increased in wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence. So that's him saying, I messed up. I did everything right, and I messed up. It was all in vain. I should have just went out and played with the others. And he says, for I have been stricken all day long and chastened every morning. So this is kind of the backdrop. He's looking at all these people. You could break this out into like the comparative game, right? We can look around at people and say, well, why is everything working out for them when I'm trying to be faithful and God's not helping me out, right? And he says this, if I had said this
If I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. When I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight.
Meaning every time I thought about this, it caused me a lot of problems.
And he says, until. This was a problem until I came into the sanctuary of God. Then I perceived their end. Surely you set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. How they are destroyed in a moment. They are utterly swept away by sudden terrors. Like a dream when one wakes, O Lord, when aroused, you will despise their form.
So the point here is like slippery. If you've ever slipped, you know things can change real fast, right? You're up and then you're on the ground like that before you can react. They're destroyed in a moment and they're swept away sudden terrors. So this is like, he knows it's going to come on. They're enjoying, and boom, it's over. And if you've ever had a bad dream and you wake, you're like, oh, glad that's over. Or if you've ever had a good dream, you wake up, dang it. You know, so like when you awake from sleep, it's just like that in a moment. You don't have a chance to react. And he's saying that's the end, that the end will be for these who are unfaithful. And he says, when my heart was embittered and I was pierced within, he's saying, so when I'm looking at all these people and I'm bitter and pierced within, I'm angry, I'm mad. He says, I was senseless and ignorant. So, meaning he didn't understand. He's acting crazy. He says in the next line, he says, like a beast before you, or I was like a beast before you. So he's like, I was acting like an animal. I was impulsive. I'm angry. I think more of not an animal. I think of a little kid just throwing a tantrum, just senseless. They don't understand. They're just mad. They want what they want. And he's like, that's how I was. Nevertheless, I'm continually with you. Why? You have taken hold of my right hand. With your counsel you will guide me, and afterward receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? Besides you, I desire nothing on earth. So he desires nothing on earth, and that's not until he comes into the sanctuary of the Lord. Because before he came into the sanctuary, what did he desire? I want the wealth, I want the power, I want the life at ease, I want the luxury, I want it all. And I don't get it, so I'm bitter and I'm angry because I'm doing everything right. And if you remember the Old Testament covenant, if you do good, God blesses you. If you do wicked, God curses you. Deuteronomy 28:29. And he's saying, this is what you said, but it's not how it's shaken out. Those who are doing wrong are actually blessed. And those like me, who, what does he say? I've washed my hands and, where was it? I've kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocent. He's like, I'm the one who's faithful. I should be getting the blessings, but I'm getting the curses. And that's why he's bitter. But then he gets to a point where he says, whom have I in heaven but you, and earth has nothing I desire besides you. He says, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. I see a little inclusio here. Bye-bye, Adonai. He says, whom have I in heaven but you? So he has God. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. So this is all he has, all he desires. And then he says, my heart. So heart. And what else? Flesh. Heart and flesh is weak. I don't know why I'm over here when I have this whole board. So he has God. Heart and flesh is weak. But then he says what?
God is the
God
strength,
is the strength.
and my portion forever.
God is my strength. So if I was going to do anything here. God is portion. So when he says he's his portion, he's saying that's all I need. So if you have a portion of food,
and this is all you need. If someone says, do you want a side of french fries? You say no. I mean, you might because they're good. But you don't need it, right? You know, like, this is all I need. I don't need any of that stuff. And that's where he ends up is God, he wanted all this junk. He's looking around at everybody. They're getting it. They're at ease. They have everything he wants on this earth. But then he comes into the sanctuary of God, and God refocuses him on what is true. And what is true and most valuable thing you can ever have is God and knowing God. And though his heart outwardly he fails, God is his strength to keep him going, and God is his portion. That's all he needs. What have I in heaven, but you in earth has nothing I desire, because God is all he needs. Suffering can take so much from us, but it can never take away God as our portion and strength. It's your final blanks. And then I put, it's not a blank, but I just put it there. If we can make the words of Psalm 73:25 true, Christ really is the portion we need in all earth, then we can fully understand Paul, who wrote that he counts all things as loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ. And so, while it's easy to start looking around and asking God for things and being told no, submitting myself right now looks like Psalm 73:25. I want those words to be true again like they were when I was 18. I want that to be true, that I don't really care about anything. As long as I have God, he's my portion. Everything else is just going to shake out. It's going to work out because I trust God for that. All right, so preview. Next time we're going to see the final lesson. We're going to examine more closely the cruciform life. Everything has been kind of leading up to this last lesson. And for the exercise, maybe when you're doing a quiet time or you've got some downtime, meditate on Psalm 75:25 and 26. And pray that the words would truly be your own heart's desire. Because I think if that were true for believers, we would be unstoppable in whatever God has for us. And suffering has a way of humbling us to see that stuff, but suffering also has a way of making us petty and bitter, like he was. He was pierced within and bitter. But he went to the sanctuary of God. And so we should surrender and worship, go to the sanctuary, and allow God to refocus our heart and our heart's desires. All right, I got the...
75 does not have 25 and 26.
I'm sorry, 73, verse 25. Yeah. Psalm 73, verse 25, verse 26. I'll read the questions for the people watching for the quiz next time. One, what is the question we all are scared to ask when faced with suffering? And I put, what if God doesn't fix it? When suffering arises, what is the first thing we submit to God? The answer is our request. Regardless of the answer, what do we immediately submit to God? And the answer is ourselves. In suffering, what sustains you? God's grace. In suffering, what dwells in you? Christ's power. What does Paul boast about his weakness? In it, he is made strong. And I even put, like, people probably believed because of his witness and suffering. What did Jesus mean when he said, after giving the sad news to John the Baptist, blessed is he who does not take offense at me? And the answer is, blessed are those whose faith does not fail when he doesn't act like expected. 8, John the Baptist submitted himself to God even to the point of, and the answer is death. 9, where's the cruciform life? Was John faithful to the cruciform life? And the answer is, the cruciform life is a life modeled after Jesus, including his death, if need be. And yes, John modeled this. The last question is, how is God's mission advanced when he chooses not to fix our suffering? And then the answer is, people Witness God's grace and power through the suffering of a person, resulting in many believing and recognizing God.